The first meeting between Europe and America was not supposed to be violent. It was not planned as a conquest, and it was not imagined as a tragedy. It began with curiosity, confusion, and cautious hope. But within a single generation, that first contact would collapse entire civilizations, redraw the global map, and permanently alter the course of human history. What happened when two worlds finally met was not a discovery. It was a collision, and once it began, there was no turning back. When European ships arrived in the Caribbean at the end of the 15th century, the crews believed they had reached the edges of Asia. They did not understand where they were, who they were meeting, or the consequences of their arrival. At the same time, the indigenous peoples watching strange wooden ships approach their shores had no concept of Europe, Christianity, or global empires. Each side interpreted the other through its own worldview, and those misunderstandings would prove fatal. For tens of thousands of years, the peoples of the Americas had lived in relative isolation from the rest of the world. They had developed their own societies, languages, religions, and technologies, all shaped by their environments. In the Caribbean, communities like the Taíno lived in complex village systems, practiced advanced agriculture, and navigated the sea with confidence. They had no metal weapons, no horses, and no immunity to old-world diseases, but they were not naive or helpless. They were experienced traders, skilled farmers, and organized societies with leaders, laws, and traditions. When Christopher Columbus landed in 1492, he encountered people who were curious rather than hostile. The Taíno approached the Europeans openly, offering food, water, and gifts. In their culture, generosity was a sign of strength and hospitality, not weakness. Columbus, however, interpreted this kindness through a European lens. In his journals, he described the natives as peaceful, obedient, and easily controlled. He believed they would make good servants and could be converted to Christianity without resistance. From the very first contact, the imbalance of perception was already forming. Europeans arrived carrying ideas shaped by centuries of war, religious conflict, and rigid hierarchies. Land was owned, power was enforced, and wealth was extracted. The indigenous peoples of the Americas often viewed land as communal, leadership as relational, and nature as something to live alongside rather than dominate. These opposing philosophies meant that even peaceful interactions were filled with misunderstanding. When natives shared land or resources, Europeans interpreted it as permission to claim ownership. When natives resisted exploitation, Europeans viewed it as rebellion. Language barriers deepened the divide. Communication relied on gestures, improvised translators, and assumptions. A handshake, a gift, or a ritual could mean entirely different things to each side. Agreements were made that one side believed were temporary and symbolic, while the other believed they were permanent and binding. These early misunderstandings laid the groundwork for betrayal and violence long before weapons were raised. As European explorers continued to arrive, first contact was repeated across the Americas. In Central America, Hernan Cortes encountered the Aztec Empire, one of the most powerful states in the hemisphere. The Aztecs ruled millions of people from their capital, Tenochtitlan, a city larger and cleaner than most European capitals at the time. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it featured canals, causeways, marketplaces, and temples that amazed Spanish visitors. Some conquistadors compared it to Venice, yet admiration did not prevent destruction. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma initially welcomed Cortes, believing he might be connected to ancient prophecies. This hesitation proved disastrous. Cortes took Moctezuma hostage, exploited internal rivalries, and used superior weapons, horses, and alliances with rival tribes to dismantle the empire from within. I think the Europeans, as a military victory was, in reality, the collapse of a civilization under pressure from disease, betrayal, and unfamiliar warfare. In North America, first contact followed a different but equally destructive pattern. Early encounters between indigenous peoples and English, French, and Dutch settlers were often cautious but cooperative. Native communities traded food, furs, and knowledge in exchange for metal tools, weapons, and goods. Europeans depended heavily on indigenous survival skills, especially in unfamiliar climates. Without native assistance, many early colonies would have failed completely, yet dependency quickly turned into domination. As European populations grew, so did their hunger for land. Treaties were signed and broken, promises were made and ignored. Native peoples were pushed off their territories, often through legal manipulation rather than open warfare. When resistance emerged, it was met with brutal force. Entire villages were destroyed as warnings to others. One of the most devastating consequences of first contact was invisible. Europeans brought diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, illnesses that indigenous populations had never encountered. With no immunity, death spread at a scale that is difficult to comprehend. In some regions, up to 90% of the population died within a century of contact. Communities collapsed not because of battle, but because parents, leaders, and healers died faster than societies could recover. Disease reshaped the Americas more than any army ever could. Entire regions were depopulated before Europeans even arrived in large numbers. This demographic collapse created the illusion of empty land, reinforcing the European belief that the continent was underused and available for settlement. In reality, the land had been carefully managed for generations through farming, controlled burns, and seasonal movement. When those systems collapsed, forests grew wild, ecosystems changed. And European settlers misunderstood the environment they were invading. Played a central role in first contact. Europeans believed they had a divine mission to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Conversion was often forced, tied to labor, land access, or survival. Indigenous spiritual practices were labeled as pagan or evil and systematically suppressed. Temples were destroyed, sacred objects were burned, and cultural memory was attacked. In many cases, conversion did not erase indigenous beliefs, but forced them underground, where they survived in altered forms. Violence escalated as misunderstandings hardened into policy. What began as exploration turned into colonization. Colonization turned into exploitation. Indigenous resistance, whether peaceful or armed, was framed as savagery. European violence was framed as civilization. This moral framing allowed atrocities to be justified as progress. First contact also transformed Europe. Crops from the Americas revolutionized global agriculture. Wealth extracted from colonized lands fueled empires. New trade routes connected continents. The modern global economy was born from this exchange, but its foundations were built on suffering and inequality. The benefits were not shared equally, and the costs were devastating for those who paid them. By the early 17th century, the world was no longer divided by oceans. It was connected by power, trade, and domination. Indigenous societies were no longer isolated civilizations, but targets within a growing global system. The consequences of first contact were irreversible. Languages disappeared. Cultures fractured. Entire histories were rewritten by the victors. Today, first contact is often simplified into a single moment, a date, or a name. But in reality, it was a long, uneven process that unfolded differently across regions and centuries. It was not a single meeting, but thousands of encounters, each shaped by fear, hope, greed, and misunderstanding. Some were peaceful, many were. Not all of them mattered. Understanding first contact forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It challenges the idea of discovery and replaces it with the reality of encounter. It reveals how power shapes history and how narratives are chosen. Most importantly, it reminds us that the modern world did not emerge naturally. It was built through decisions, actions, and consequences that are still felt today. The world after first contact was not better or worse by default. It was different. And that difference came at a cost that cannot be undone. In the next episode, we will explore why indigenous civilizations, despite their strength and sophistication, were ultimately overwhelmed. Not by weakness, but by forces they could not see, predict, or stop.